In this video, we're going to be looking at elasticity of supply. So elasticity of supply is how responsive the quantity supplied is to a change in the price. So can businesses quickly supply more of a product in response to a higher price, or does it take quite a long time to supply more of a product following a price increase? Elasticity of supply can be relatively elastic, unit elastic, or relatively inelastic, just like demand. So a good example of price elasticity of supply at the moment is the property market. The supply of property is quite inelastic because it takes quite a long time to build property, to acquire the land, to get all the permits to build, and therefore prices are really high for property at the moment, but we can't supply, it takes a while to supply more to the market because of the long time it takes to build and acquire the land, and as I said, all these things. So that's causing the price of property to stay relatively high at the moment. So here's an example of an inelastic and elastic supply curve. The inelastic supply curve is fairly vertical. And what I mean by that is, in this case, there has been a large increase in price from P1 to P2, and that's only caused a small increase in the quantity supplied. So supply is relatively inelastic, relatively vertical, because a big change in price is only going to cause a small change in the quantity supplied. In the other example, there has been a small change in price, so P1 to P2, and that's caused a large increase in the quantity supplied. So small change in price, large change in quantity supplied, that means it has a relatively elastic supply curve, and it will have a relatively flat curve or horizontal curve. The PES is the same as the PED, except instead of saying demanded, it's supplied. So it's percentage change in quantity supplied over percentage change in price. And just like demand, if the PES is less than 1, we have an inelastic supply curve. So if the change in price is bigger than the change in the quantity supplied, then it would be inelastic. If the change in quantity supplied is larger than the percentage change in price, it will be elastic. And if it's the same, it's still unit elastic. The good thing with PES is we don't have to talk about revenue, so there is less to learn in regards to price elasticity of supply. Factors that affect the price elasticity of supply. The first one is storability. You'll also hear it referred to as durability or perishability. Items that can be stored, like minerals, wheat, wool, wine, will generally be more elastic, because as soon as the price goes up, even if the price goes from say $10 to $12, we've got all this stock that we can just quickly supply to the market. So a small rise in price can cause a big increase in the quantity supply. So serviceable, perishable items therefore have a more inelastic supply curve because they cannot be stored. So fresh tomatoes will have a more inelastic supply than canned tomatoes, because fresh tomatoes need to be grown. They will go off if we have them for too long, so we can't store them. So if fresh tomatoes increase in price, say from $5 to $6, it's going to take a while to supply more to the market. But canned tomatoes, well, we've got those stored. We can get those out really quickly. So canned tomatoes have a more elastic supply curve. Fresh tomatoes are more inelastic supply curve. The first factor, storability. Don't get confused between the factors impacting elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. They are different, and if you say one the wrong way, you will not receive any marks. So the first one is storability. Second one is what we call resource mobility and unused industry capacity. So if we work in an industry where there are a lot of workers that aren't working to their full capacity, if we have a lot of machines that aren't working to their full capacity, they're just laying idle, then what we can do is, if suddenly the demand for a product increases, we can quickly supply more to the market because we have all this unused capacity. So if that will have a more elastic supply curve. Quantity can be increased if there's a price rise. If we're already using our resources to their full capacity, then we can't really supply more to the market following an increase in price. So it will be more an inelastic supply. So that's what we talk about when we use unused industry capacity. If we have spare labour, spare capital, it will have a more elastic supply curve. Resource mobility is basically how quickly we can shift resources from one area to another. So a good example of that is sort of unskilled workers. So if we're, say, picking oranges and suddenly the price of apples goes through the roof, or the price of bananas goes through the roof, we can quickly shift resources, or our labour resources in particular, from oranges to apples, or oranges to bananas, because it's pretty unskilled work. It's easy to pick one or the other. They basically have the same skills. But if resources aren't easily substitutable between particular industries, so say the demand for doctors went up, then we can't just get all the plumbers and say, right, you're doctors now. That doesn't work. You don't want a plumber operating on you or a teacher operating on you. So industries where resources can be quickly shifted from one area to another will have a more inelastic supply curve. will have a more elastic supply curve. Resources can be shifted, a more mobile or more dynamic efficiency will increase the elasticity of supply. Skilled industries, generally a more inelastic supply curve. And the last one is the time period. In the short term, it can be hard for firms to expand supply following a price rise for their product, especially if resources are immobile. A good example of this is a lot of apprenticeships, a lot of trades. So the demand for plumbers, for example, increases. In the short term, it takes a while to increase supply to the market because people need to get trained. There's only a certain amount of plumbers. In the long term, people can get trained. People can do their apprenticeship. So 6, 7, 8 years down the track, the elasticity of supply is more elastic, and therefore more people supply their resources to the market and the price will eventually go down. So in the long term, supply is more elastic. Over the years, the availability of most resources can be increased, making supply more responsive to price changes. Another good example of that is the mining industry. In the short term, people were getting paid really high prices because there was a shortage of miners. In the long term, more people were willing to go into the industry, develop the skills, and therefore it led to an increase, a more elastic supply in the long term. So the longer the production period, the more elastic the supply curve, because resources can be shifted into these industries in the long term. Here's just a quick question. The price elasticity of demand is usually the same as the price elasticity of supply. Explain whether this statement is correct with respect to the market for alcoholic beverages. It's not true. Price elasticity of demand and supply are completely unrelated. So alcohol, for example, has a relatively inelastic demand curve because it's addictive. People are going to generally be willing to pay the higher price. When people drink, they generally lose their judgment. So after your 37th beer, you don't really care about the price anymore. And that can mean it has an inelastic demand curve, same with cigarettes. But the price elasticity of supply of things like alcohol and cigarettes is quite elastic because they're storable and therefore we can supply more to the market as soon as there's an increase in price. So elasticity of demand, products can have an inelastic demand curve and an elastic supply curve or vice versa. They are independent of one another. That's the elasticity of supply.